professional journalism in certain specific directions. It's not entirely neutral. I mean, the idea that you could be neutral is nonsensical anyway. I mean, something's got to be on the front page, something's going to be buried in the back, and something's not going to get covered at all. You've got to make value judgments. I mean, you just can't get around that to begin with. So if you look at the biases that are built into the whole professional model, even at its best, they're fairly striking. Manipulation is a science, and I think in this case, this notion of liberal media goes to the core problem that the free market right faces in our society, and has faced for a long time, and it's a dire problem today, is that the agenda of the free market right, which is to enrich the few and screw over the many, doesn't work. The majority of the people don't like it. They never have. You don't win elections on lowering taxes on billionaires and slashing social services to the middle class and working class. But that's the ultimate agenda of the free market right. So you don't win elections that's not the issues you run on. So you find other things to run on: patriotism, racism, abortion, gay rights. You don't want to talk about the ultimate underlying purpose, the whole purpose of your agenda. And that's the way it's always dressed up. And you know, that's what our journalism has fallen completely within that trap. I mean, it's the great truths of economic inequality, of economic relations, gets sort of compartmentalized and marginalized. So that debate is lost, and we're stuck in the absurd situation where, you know, working class individuals' economic concerns somehow get sort of turned into sort of like whether they're anti-immigration rather than fundamental concerns about social services, education, and healthcare. And the whole notion of the liberal bias of the 60s and 70s that argument was made has completely collapsed. There is no credible argument for the liberal bias. And in fact, what you see today, when it is talked about, and it still is talked about, I mean, it's still the legal opposition, the official opposition of our media culture. When you see talk today about the liberal bias, the credible argument, not credible, the argument is no longer made that news media are hard on Republicans and easy on Teddy Kennedy and Ralph Nader. That's not the argument. That argument is so ludicrous as it doesn't even pass the giggle test. The argument now simply redefines left-right entirely in ways that drop out core issues of class, core issues of corporate power. And this is how you'll see a Chris Matthews use it, or Bill O'Reilly, or the Wall Street Journal. In this strange world that they inhabit, their vision of left-right is this. The liberals are Ivy League intellectuals who believe in gay rights and abortion rights and don't necessarily go to church. And they're rich and hoity-toity types. And conservatives are people like them, hardworking, beer-drinking, oftentimes Catholic, working class, usually white people who believe in God and America and kicking ass. What we have increasingly is that the private sector is virtually off limits. It's simply not covered at all. Private power, which is so truly important to really understanding how power exists in our society, is uncovered in any sort of critical journalism. It's sort of given carte blanche to just trot right on through life. And public power is only covered in very narrow parameters. The sorts of issues they get covered are the ones that tend to be debates between the mainstream political parties. On issues that the mainstream political parties are in agreement upon, there's virtually no coverage whatsoever in our news media, no critical watchdog coverage. For example, the military establishment in this country, for which we spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year for no known reason, is not covered critically because both political parties are in bed with it. They're both debating who can raise the budget the most. I mean, that's the big fight. That type of right wing, anti-labor, pro-business right wing, has made a concerted effort to move media to the right. They understood that media was not sympathetic enough to their aims, that they weren't getting the coverage they liked. Media is too much reflecting the opinions of people who weren't rabidly pro-free market. The media wasn't socialist, but it was more welfare statist. It was more comfortable in accepting things like Social Security as being a legitimate enterprise rather than questioning it. And what we've seen since the mid-1970s is that all the great conservative foundations have devoted almost all their money to ideological warfare. About half of it's gone into changing the media, moving it rightward, and about half of it has gone into educational institutions, creating chairs in free enterprise and business schools or journalism schools. But the whole idea is, what the conservatives have done with their money is say, we're going to put all our money into ideological warfare to try to move everything to the right, and then we'll let all the liberal foundations just give breakfast to poor kids. They can pick up the pieces of the mess we're going to make, but we're not going to worry about doing anything but moving the whole political debate to the right, to free market solutions as much as humanly possible. Let's say you're trying to change journalism. Let's say you think journalism is not sufficiently appreciative and in love with free markets, big business, that it's too sympathetic to labor unions, too sympathetic to environmental regulations, too sympathetic to old age pension programs like Social Security, that you want to get a journalism that's more in tune with the issues as you see them. Well, how can you change it? Well, you can try buying the media, but that costs a lot of money, and you actually already own it. The problem isn't that conservatives don't own the media. The biggest shareholders have conservative politics. That's not the issue. The problem is that there's a certain amount of autonomy in professional practices here you've got to intervene with. How do you do that, besides owning it and crushing the separation of church and state? Well, there are 2 or 3 real key ways, if you understand how journalism works, that you do that. One is you try to train more conservatives to become journalists. So starting in the late 60s and early 70s, you saw the growth of a whole coterie of college newspapers built around conservative values. There's one at Dartmouth. I think the Dartmouth Review is the classic one. Most major campuses had one. They still have them. So that instead of just having the college liberal newspaper growing out of the 60s or 70s with hippies and radicals writing for it, you'd have a red, white, and blue, flag-waving, free market-loving conservative paper. But then you'd be training like hundreds of journalists in these papers who would then go on and get jobs and internships at the Washington Times, at the Wall Street Journal, at the National Review, and you could start building up an armada of right-wing conservative journalists who can then become talking heads on the Fox News Channel and MSNBC and sort of pontificate conservative viewpoints. That was one thing you do, and it's been very effective. They've really created a whole farm system to train right-wing, free market-loving, labor union-hating journalists who will basically parrot whatever the right-wing line of the day is, as we've seen. The other thing you do is you try to give sources. So much of journalism depends on who the source of the story is. And so you've seen the creation of these foundations or institutes in Washington, like the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, that basically are extraordinarily well-funded groups. I mean, they're millions and millions of dollars. And they have experts from wealthy right-wingers, and there are a lot of them. There are people who, the Coors family, the Mellons, there are lots of very rich people in this country, most of whom have inherited their money, who think any taxation on them is an onerous burden, who think Social Security and labor unions are terrible things. Of course, they don't benefit by either of them, and are committed to an ideological view that we want to roll the clock back to a point where business is in unambiguous control of society, with no taxation, and this full function of government being to provide police to protect private property, or military to keep foreign countries in line if they challenge investments overseas. This is the worldview, in fact, more or less, of these various far-right, free market-loving institutes. But what they realize is if they just sort of come off frothing at the mouth with sort of free market rhetoric, they're not going to get anywhere. Rather, what they did is they started these foundations, institutes, Cato, Heritage, American Enterprise Institute, and there are others as well, in Washington, and then employ, at very high salaries oftentimes, sort of experts on issues. And these experts then can be called on by media for opinions and insights on issues.
Someone like you.
Someone like me, conceivably. For example, let's say George W. Bush is going to appoint someone to the Supreme Court. He makes an appointment. Well, there will be 2 or 3 of these right-wing groups will have a full-time or close to full-time expert on staff who will be able to answer any questions about this person or talk at length on this issue. So if you're a source and you can have someone weigh in on trade deals, on Supreme Court appointments, on tax bills, giving your perspective, if you've got a series of people who sound like they know what they're talking about of all sorts of degrees, you can really influence the news. So they put a lot of money into creating this enormous bank of sources, and it's been very effective. The internet, the rise of the internet is the most important issue that faces people in media of this generation. It's the central defining issue, not just for media, but really for just about everything else. It's the defining technology of our age. And the argument has gone, starting in the early to mid-90s, that the internet is going to basically eliminate the existing media system. The classic comment on this came from John Perry Barlow, a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who was sort of one of the original sort of cyber enthusiasts. And he argued that we don't have to worry about these big media giants buying up film studios and TV networks, because all they're doing is rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic. The iceberg they're going to hit is the internet with its limitless number of channels, 500 billion. And once you've got options of 500 billion channels in the internet, who's going to care about Rupert Murdoch's Rinky Fox channel or General Electric's NBC? You're going to have hundreds of millions of other choices. They're just going to fade away. They're going to become extinct. They're going to be like the dinosaurs after the comet hits the planet. That's basically the argument. And that argument is used widely now by the media giants themselves. When AOL merges with Time Warner, when Viacom swallows up CBS, when Vivendi buys Universal, the argument is, well, we've got to get bigger and bigger, otherwise we're going to get killed by the internet when it comes along with its 500 billion channels. So we've got to get bigger and bigger so we can, what they mean to say, crush all the competition before it gets started. What is the evidence that the internet is going to overthrow the existing media system? That the internet is going to eliminate the big giants like Disney and Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and replace them with, billions of small-time entrepreneurs with a copy of George Gilder's polemics under their arm, sort of competing in the commercial golden marketplace of ideas, and we all live happily ever after. Have we seen a flowering in the marketplace with all sorts of new viable competitors who are going to take on the media giants and use the internet to enter the media world? In fact, let's do a survey. How many successful, commercially viable companies have come along to use the internet as a platform to become successful media content providers to compete with the Disneys and AOL Time Warners? How many has the internet launched? Zero. L. Zipperowski. None. No. So far the track record isn't very impressive. There are lots of people who have tried. They've all gone belly up, or they're all losing money and hoping someone will buy them out and save them. No one's been able to make a profit using the internet as a platform to sell media content or to provide media content on the internet. So far, the internet as a challenge to the commercial media system, a direct challenge where it's going to steal market, non-existent. Hasn't happened at all after 7 years. And all signs point that it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. You couldn't raise a nickel on Wall Street today for an IPO for an internet media content site. Hey, I'm going to start a content site on the internet. Give me 50 million. You couldn't get past the intern at the front door with that message. You'd be hurled out in your butt. I mean, you see the evidence for this. Microsoft, mind you, with its deep pockets, with its billions of dollars it's sitting on in cash, was it trying to go into the internet and use it to become a content player, saying now we can sort of do content too, we have to do that. They started their magazine, Slate. They were going to do a local newspaper type thing with want ads and listings in every city. They spent tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars trying to bankroll a content presence in the internet. And a couple of years ago, they threw in the towel. They said, we can't do it. We can't compete with the giants. There's not money here for us. We give up. Microsoft gives up. What chance do you or I or some entrepreneur have? The answer is zero. In the case of digital television like the internet and digital media in general, I mean, technically, you're absolutely right. We had possibly tremendous possibilities. But what the government has done, pushed by these powerful lobbies, is it's basically saying to the Wall Street, to these companies, you guys you develop these technologies however you can make the most money. That's what it's all about. And that'll be the best way to serve us. Now, what satisfies these companies to make the most money, in fact, is going to be directly opposite or diametrically opposed or significantly divergent, at the very least, from what we might actually want if we had a range of possibilities to pick from. It isn't in our interest to basically have a half dozen companies own all the airways and then sort of marinate us with advertising and commercialism. We'd all, I think, much prefer to have 30 or 40 different owners or 60 or 70 different owners, with restrictions on commercialism if the market doesn't prove sufficient. There's a real diversity. But that wasn't a choice that was given to us because the big companies that dominated these debates, that wasn't an issue that, a position that interested them. None of them could make money off that position.
The notion that the internet was created or has grown because of no governmental involvement is, of course, dead wrong. The internet is free and open because of, not in spite of, governmental policies that have prohibited discriminatory uses of this technology. The fight is to maintain the status quo. The interesting thing from our standpoint is that we are really fighting to keep a system that was set up a particular way, to keep it from changing, rather than having to take a system that's already broken and try to fix it. It's a lot easier to try to maintain the relative pristine nature of the internet today than it is to try to fix something that's completely and hopelessly dominated. And that's, if there's cause for optimism, that's where it lies.
I think history's proven that facts on the ground, or, you know, its possession is 9/10 of the law.
Correct. And Michael Powell, on this open access question that we're talking about, this is exactly where the philosophical divide comes in. He is a strong proponent of the watchful waiting view, which is that you see what happens and then you try to move in and do something to protect competition if you see a problem arise. That doesn't work. What works is identifying competitive bottlenecks in advance, and really this is a tradition that lies in the heart of the FCC's public interest legal powers, to identify potential competition and to make sure that the bottlenecks don't happen, to move prophylactically to protect competition rather than try to attack it afterwards. If you wait until the bottleneck develops and then try to break it up, what you have is litigation like the Microsoft case that runs on years and years and years and years while the monopoly continues. Murdoch's efforts to ingratiate himself with the Chinese government, which have been pretty well reported, are more blatant and more transparent than almost anything that we deal with domestically in the United States. The kind of raw power that works in places like China and works in places like Eastern Europe doesn't work in true democracies, and Murdoch is capable of being much more subtle and much more insidious, I would say, in Australia, in England, in the U.S. than he is in China. But when he has the it's useful, instructive kind of experience when the political system permits something that is more blatant. He's very comfortable doing it. Basically, he has changed the way in which programming is presented and covered to satisfy the desires of the Chinese government for purposes of getting a competitive advantage, and not every one of his competitors has been willing to do so.
And this is a second point that feeds into the same thing, with who has really been given attention and who has really been given the respect in this debate. And I want to make sure it's right, because we know we've got problems with accuracy in the media. So I want to make sure this article in the New York Times is right. It says that media lobbyist Dick Wiley, whose clients, I don't know the man, he's probably out there, whose clients include numerous large media companies and partners at his firm, held at least 34 meetings with FCC officials, according to the record, the open record.
Why is it in the best interest of people to the left or liberals or whatever they want to call us to help you to consolidate in ways that your conservative views will be more and more dominant? We will get shut out. I'm worried that as you go before DOJ, and maybe, I don't know if Mr. Ashcroft is your friend or not, his conservative views will be reflected in your programming. So why should we support this, even though we don't have direct responsibility for approval or disapproval? Maybe some of us should make a hell of a lot more noise than we're making, because you're scaring the hell out of me.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I can assure you that, we are bringing diversity of opinion. There is diversity of opinion on Fox News. You may disagree with that. We have many liberals there, many liberal invited. We have liberal commentators, as we have conservative ones.
Who are your liberal commentators?
Alan Combs, for one. Greta Van Susteren. You know, it's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. I know you've had problems. You've made statements about Mr. O'Reilly.
And of course, one of the problems of the modern media is that it has tended to obliterate the local political meeting. I was elected in 1984 for Chesterfield, which is a mining town, and in the course of 3 weeks I did 70 public meetings. People came to churches, came to meetings, you spoke in the open air, and you could hear the candidate. Nowadays, all you do is hear the media's description of what the candidate is saying. And one of the strange things about it is that politics is now presented in terms of politicians and not politics. I don't think the media are interested in politics. They're interested in politicians, which is a wholly different subject. Who's doing this, about their private life, about their background, about what they must be thinking, might be thinking when they said something, why did they say it? But what they say is very, very hard to hear. And I think this is, in a sense, indeed quite deliberately, destroying the genuine democratic base on which people are elected. It's very interesting to me that President Clinton, for example, was elected by only 1 in 5 of the American people. 4 out of 5 Americans didn't register, didn't vote, or voted against him. So Clinton, on 20% of his own electorate, claimed to have a mandate and claimed to exercise the power of the United Presidency, which is the most powerful position in the world, with nuclear armory and its economic and political power and so on. And that process is beginning to happen here. The Labour government was elected with only 1 in 4 voting for it. And the danger of that, the political danger of that, is very, very great. Because if people don't vote, because they're not motivated to vote, because the whole thing switches them off, the spin doctors, the focus groups, all the marketing rubbish that goes into modern political argument, if they don't vote, it destroys the legitimacy of the government that is elected, and then people become cynical, and that is the moment at which the hard right picks up. Because my recollection of Germany in the 1930s is very, very clear. When the German people had mass unemployment, they were pessimistic, they were hopeless, they were depressed. Then they went for the man who had a scapegoat. It's the Jews, it's the communists, it's the trade unionists. And that is the danger. Democracy requires a well-informed and understanding people with clear ideas which they wish to see represented. And now we're being managed and not represented.
The whole fame thing drives almost all national affairs. If a political figure is on TV a lot, they have more power, they're perceived as more important. And if they criticize someone or they are in the limelight doing or saying something, it has more weight than anything else. And so if you're not famous, first of all, if you're not famous, you're not going to be elected if you're a politician. If you're not famous, that means no one must watch you if you're a broadcaster. You may be famous at 2 a.m. I mean, we're in this culture where everything is measured. And, you know, I don't know what the Q rating was for Bill Clinton, but certain political actors are more gifted when it comes to fame and the media and cultivating the media, and they play to the media's worst instincts, and they're each pandering to each other. The politician is benefiting from constant attention. The media is benefiting from their constant Greek tragedy-like ups and downs in their careers. And the accessibility and availability and hyperactivity of a president like Clinton is fantastic in a 24/7 news cycle, because you're going to have the guy playing the saxophone on a late-night show, and you're going to have him doing a news briefing from the White House, and maybe taking 3 trips outside D.C. all in the same day, And all those media markets are just ecstatic. All those different outlets are all ecstatic. The fame of Clinton continues. Let's freeze frame all of that. Did anything in America change, however? Did any of it mean anything? Did the equation about the most powerful interest in America change when it comes to the American people? None of that was affected at all. It's like a magician. You know, the hand is quicker than the eye. You're watching all this stuff, and it's nothing but cotton candy. It's nothing but fluff, and it's all irrelevant.
But that major thing is not to be covered.
Right, but the major thing will not be covered. It's too close to the bone. If you show the mercenary culture at work and people benefiting legally, unfortunately, from the way the system is set up, including, which would have to include the media if you do it thoroughly, then you will be exposing yourself not only to ridicule, but condemnation and possibly even in some cases prosecution. And so who wants to go down that road? And so it also costs money. It's just, as a practical matter, it just takes time to do those kinds of stories. And you do have to have lawyers looking at every word, and you do have to be buttoned down perfectly and, you know, all that. So it's a hassle. But I have been getting so frustrated by what's happened to the media that I decided, we've investigated the political influence and the lobbying and other political shenanigans of all these industries, from the timber industry to the chemical industry to all the influences around the presidential candidates, you name it, healthcare lobbying back in '94. We've looked at all those. And I decided it was time that we looked at the media and itself. And we had half a dozen people working for 6 months, and we investigated, and we found, of course, that the most powerful special interest in Washington today is the media, because not only do they give money and lobby and do all the things that industries do in Washington and companies do, but they, of course, control whether or not a politician's mug gets on the tube. Now, that's power. That's the ultimate power in a political realm, is controlling perceptions.
That's what I see with you guys. It's the old, if the tree falls in the forest and it's not captured by a video camera and broadcast, did it fall? Does it make a sound?
Well, that's right. No, that's exactly right. And the fun part of our study that I'm very proud of is we had government records. So we knew that the media corporations had spent $115 million lobbying Congress. We knew the names of the firms. We know who they lobbied. We even know what they lobbied about. In this country, a lot of the journalists have become as wealthy as the people they cover. In Washington, a lot of the journalists covering the president have their children at Sitwell Friends and other private schools, and presidential candidates or new presidents put their children in the same school where the journalists are in, and they compare notes about teachers. You know, and in the old days, journalists, you know, I remember there's a great line James Carville said to me during the health care debate. I thought, whatever your position on about Clinton and Carville and health care, his comment was very telling. He said, I don't think there are 5 reporters out there, I don't think there's a single reporter in Washington today covering the health care debate who knows 5 people that don't have health insurance. They can't name one probably that doesn't have health insurance. The idea of not having health insurance is like something from Mars to them. They're living such a cushy, yuppified life that they're in a bubble. Broadcasters don't cover politics for the most part, but they're happy to take paid ads from politicians. And they've gone from $80 million in 1981 to $1 billion in the last election as a major revenue source. So they don't cover politics. It's half what it was in '96. '96 was half what it was in '92 in terms of news coverage about politics. So the citizen's not going to know what the issues are. The citizen's not going to know what people are talking about or what's important or what this candidate has done that we should know about or shouldn't know about. None of that's going to be discussed. Their source of news will be paid ads that the candidates want you to know about. And it's pretty grim. I mean, so there's a dumbing down effect, which we've talked about.
And the dumbing down is a word I'd like to get a bigger definition of.
Right. Well, when I say dumbing down, I mean that the information that is provided to the public is inadequate and almost non-existent. So you'll cover a complex issue like utility deregulation in 45 seconds or a minute on the evening news. Well, good luck. No one can understand anything that complicated. Even if they had 10 minutes, it'd be hard. But a minute is hopeless. And so the media, basically, they'll have someone crying. There'll be someone who was personally affected, or maybe the street light went out and they got hit. and we'll feel sorry for that person, but then when it gets to the larger issues, they'll start to wrap it up because it's a little too complicated. Part of that is the medium itself. Part of it is because they don't want to go near that subject for various reasons. It takes time, and they think people don't care about it. They also give the least common denominator type of programming. They assume that people want to watch Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and Survivor and basically crap. And so they pander to the least common denominator. There's a lot of that goes on, and you get into debates with commercial broadcasters that, you know, well, did you notice PBS has just terrific ratings? No one watches it. And, you know, you get into these big discussions about what do the people really want, and if they really want all this great investigative stuff, how come no one does it?
The reporter will cover the story, and the reporter goes out and presumably finds the story. All too often, the reporters, or the editors rather, put the story into a Procrustean bed, if you will. They have their minds made up at what the story is before the reporter ever goes out. And if the reporter comes back with a story that differs from what their preconception was, they say, well, that's not the story we're looking for. Well, I'm sorry, but that's the story that's there. So that happens quite a bit.
Today, the language is all neutered down. I mean, it's completely sanitized and you know, scrubbed so that it will be substantially neutral. So you won't have any idea what the person really thinks, and generally it won't get anyone in trouble for saying it. And we also, of course, won't choose topics that are inconvenient or embarrassing topics. And that's what passes for news coverage. And the news coverage will not necessarily be much more explicit than that, and that's just how it works, and it's just kind of understood.
There's a continuum between the media and politics, and you have to take into account that an awful lot of guys in politics get paid a lot of money to attempt to manipulate the media. These are the so-called spin doctors. These are the guys who take a political candidate's message and put it across in the most effective way. They use the media to their benefit as much as they can. And when it comes to reporters, some reporters are very sophisticated in not letting them do that. Other reporters not so sophisticated because, you know, this is a learning process that we go through, and if this is your first time around covering a campaign, you have to be very careful that these slick political operatives will not try to work their way into the story that you think is perfectly objective.
Is it really possible these days to pin anyone down? It seems that everyone is so good at being evasive on message. So, I mean, could you discuss that?
Well, an awful lot of guys are being paid an awful lot of money to make sure that that the candidate's message, the message he or she wants to put across, is what gets out to the media, and not what the reporter wants to get across. And pin them down. Is it possible for a reporter in an interview such as this to take a politician and make that politician answer the question in a way that the politician doesn't want to? Very rarely in politics these days. Very rarely. And of course, the higher you get in the quest for political office, the more sophisticated the media manipulation becomes.
I know for a fact that CBS, NBC, and ABC have cut their international bureaus. They used to be seen all, they used to have big London bureau, Paris bureau, something. A lot of them have cut back, so they cover stories on an international level just using, they used to, have their reporter, boom, fly them in, cover the story with your own tape. Now they take a lot of their international stories off a tape feed, much the way we take them. Reuters feed, AP TV, stuff like that, where, they're not actually in, especially they're not actually covering, let's say, any kind of civil war in Africa or something. They're just getting tape from a bureau, from the AP or Reuters or something, and putting it on their news. They're not, so the coverage is not the same.
Everything is basically the there's a fool every minute, and let's see if we can fool them, cynicism, really. And it's all PR. Everyone has PR. If you look at in Washington alone, there are thousands of people who do nothing but public relations. If you look at the number of congressional and executive branch employees who do public relations, I don't know what the numbers are, but there's thousands of them. And 20 or 30 years ago, there were no more than a few hundred of them. So there's been an explosion in the business of image making and purveying information on your behalf, or your agency's behalf, or your company's behalf. And if you don't have a good PR firm working for you, and you don't have good bookers and marketers and focus group people and this and that, all these kind of pros, then you'll be shut out, and you won't be on the shows. You won't be the one that they call. You won't be the one giving lectures to corporate groups around the country. You won't be seen as effective, and your books won't be bestsellers. Then there's also just the obfuscation factor, which drives me up the wall. I mean, the revenue enhancement, not taxes, you know, collateral damage, not thousands of innocent people being murdered. I mean, you get a lot of I guess what Orwell would call the politically euphemistic language that is used by everyone, by politicians, but also by news anchors, that will summarize in a 1 or 2 sentence lead-in to a piece something where you could write entire books about it, and so it'll be the most bland thing. You don't quite know what you're hearing. Oh, we're going to go today and look at such and such, and then you'll see some piece, and you've just kind of given me the froth off the top of the beer there. I mean, I don't really know what you're talking about, but it passes for news, and it fills 22 minutes. The conundrum for folks who are frustrated with the media and the news media and the coverage of the news media, and I count myself among them, and I also am a veteran of that world, and I have many friends in that world as we speak, is that the public does watch some of this nonsense, and that's why they do it. They are pandering to the lowest common denominator, and when you criticize a news executive at one of the networks and you say, why are you putting this crap on the air? Do you have a conscience? How do you look yourself in the mirror? Their answer is, you know, people are watching that stuff. And they can all go to the Lair News Hour if they don't, you know, what are their numbers? And they'll start doing numbers. Like news is defined like a Gallup poll, but we all put on what's most interesting to the masses, and that's what ought to be news, and that's what the news value is. It's not what the people's right to know and things that they ought to know as a people in our democracy. It comes down to what sells the most, and what, say, all the prurient sensationalistic values of either death or sex or, you know, those kinds of things. And that is the principal thing that drives the news values, is how are your numbers. So I'm kind of fascinated by the whole thing. When I look back at what Orwell wrote, and I look at Stalinist Russia and everything, what the big tragedy to me is that you have these multi-billion-dollar corporations making money hand over fist, obscenely rich companies. And when they get into any trouble, the first thing they'd cut are the reporters. And they don't cut the people that do sell the ads, of course. They want to make more money. So their profit margins are very, very high, and they're all watching their quarterly earnings and latest financial statements. And these are media corporations that are now owned by, you know, by the Disneys and the Westinghouses and the, you know, GEs of the world that have, you know, sometimes checkered backgrounds when it comes to their own conduct as corporations, but they're not into disseminating information. And so you had a situation, a fairly remarkable situation last week, where the chairman of Disney meets with the Washington Bureau of ABC News, and Ted Koppel, the well-known Nightline anchor, says to Michael Eisner, the head of Disney, do you know who Dave Kaplan is? And Koppel starts listing all of the dead journalists who died trying to cover stories all over the world. Kaplan I knew myself and worked with. He died in Bosnia, was killed by a sniper's bullet. Eisner knew none of them. They're getting ready to fire hundreds of employees at ABC. Koppel's point was, you guys are just making money, and we could be making widgets here. There's no sense of responsibility as a news media of what you owe to the public and what you owe to this country as a democracy. And that's outrageous, and that's worrisome.
Why didn't we find out more about that bill before it was passed?
Well, because who's going to report on it? The media? I mean, we didn't find out more about it because it was not in the interest of the media to tell us that story. I mean, if you go back and study news coverage around the 1996 Telecommunications Act, the most significant law passed about the media in 50 years, there was hardly any news coverage other than a few newspaper stories. There was one Nightline where Ted Koppel got into some of the issues one time over the course of 1 year. You know, we're talking about minuscule coverage about an extraordinarily huge issue of our time. One of my hobby horses, I actually did a speech before 400 government ethics officials from all over the world down in Florida back in December about what I call legal corruption. And I noted that most of the things the Center for Public Integrity has investigated over the last 11 years are in fact legal. Whether it's Bob Dole getting a condominium, $100,000 under the market price from Dwayne Andreas, the head of an agribusiness multi-billion-dollar corporation that's getting subsidies that Bob Dole helped get passed, and no one thinks there's a problem. That's legal. To the digital spectrum giveaway, the media has gotten $70 billion of a taxpayer-owned asset that's given away. The full gamut, both parties, we have a substantial amount in this country of legal corruption. We have done a massive investigation of the 50 states, the state legislatures. This idea that corruption in this country is only in Washington is absurd, of course. Now, when you start patenting genes that are naturally occurring in human beings, and you start deciding that you own the patent for this particular gene, and they start issuing patents for it, and you've got a $10 or $20 billion a year industry just doing the copywriting and patenting of genes, not counting the technology, just the lobbying and the patenting process, you can see what's going on here. I mean, everything is for sale, basically. And if you've got money and lawyers, you'll get it, you'll win. I'm sorry to be so cynical about it, but that's kind of what happens.
Florida violated the Equal Protection Clause, only applied, they said, to Bush v. Gore, not to any other case. Now, if their ruling set forth a valid legal principle that was good enough for Bush v. Gore, why wasn't it good enough for other cases? Constitutional scholars will tell you that this is the first time in the 210-year history of the court that the court limited its ruling to the case before it, saying it did not constitute legal precedent for other cases. For any conservative people out in the audience, I would ask them to hypothesize a reversal of roles. Let's say Gore's ahead, 8 o'clock, December the 9th, Saturday morning, by 154 votes. Would Scalia have stepped in and done the same thing for Gore that he did for Bush? Who is Scalia? He's not a typical Republican or conservative. He's a right-wing ideologue of the Rush Limbaugh school. He's the judicial darling of the far right. To him, Gore is probably anathema and execration. It is absolutely unimaginable, absolutely inconceivable that he would have stepped in and said, we've got to stop this recount because if it continues, it could threaten irreparable harm to Al Gore. That would not have happened. That could not have happened. This is a well-known secret. Scalia wants to become Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And obviously he knew that if Gore won, he never would become Chief Justice. Also, he has two sons that were working for law firms heavily involved in the Bush campaign. So under Title 28, U.S. Code, Section 455, if there's any conflict of interest or even an appearance of a conflict of interest, the justices have a duty to disqualify themselves. Lawyers say recuse themselves. These justices did not do that here.
There's a code of conduct for federal judges, which is largely derived from a model document put together by the American Bar Association. The American Bar Association is a private organization, but it has invested time and money in putting together what it considers to be a wise document for states and the federal government to adopt to govern their judges. And in fact, every state has adopted that document as binding on their judges, though most states have made some changes in it. Not every state has adopted it literally. In addition, the federal judiciary has adopted that document again with changes through the work of lower court judges. and that's called the Code of Conduct for U.S. Judges. That Code of Conduct applies to all lower federal judges, but it doesn't apply to the Supreme Court, because the judges who put it together, the federal judges who did this, did not believe that they had the authority to write rules governing the behavior of justices on the Supreme Court. So that document doesn't apply to the Supreme Court. However, the justices of the Supreme Court, or various of them, have from time to time said that although the document doesn't apply to them, they will govern themselves according to its precepts.